People vanish in the wilderness every year. Most are written off as accidents, exposure, a wrong turn, bad luck. But sometimes what's left behind doesn't make sense. Footprints too large, claw marks too deep, stories too disturbing to ignore. For centuries, stories have echoed across continents of something watching, something waiting, something that doesn't want to be found. Whether you believe in legends or not, the disappearances are real, and so are the warnings. Tucked deep in the Pacific Northwest, Black Hollow National Park stretched endlessly, a vast and untamed wilderness of towering evergreens, mist-covered peaks, and deep, winding valleys. Covering nearly 1 million acres, it was home to an astonishing variety of wildlife, from elusive mountain lions to black bears and the occasional gray wolf. Despite its beauty, the park was known for its treacherous terrain, unpredictable weather, hidden ravines, and dense forests that could easily swallow the unwary. It was a place where the line between the known and the unknown blurred, a place where men disappeared without a trace. Park Ranger Thomas Calloway had spent over a decade patrolling these lands. He was a man of discipline, a former Marine who had found solace in the solitude of the wilderness after leaving the military. Unlike many of the younger rangers, Thomas never took unnecessary risks. He was methodical, pragmatic, and respected among his peers for his extensive knowledge of the park. He knew the trails like the back of his hand, understood the rhythms of nature, and had an almost instinctive sense for when something was out of place. On the evening of October 14, 1987, Thomas set out on what should have been a routine patrol near the northern section of the park, close to an area marked on maps as restricted. Officially, it was a wildlife study zone, off-limits due to delicate ecological research. Unofficially, it had always been the subject of quiet speculation among the rangers. No one knew exactly what was in that part of the forest, but strange occurrences had been reported for years. That night, Thomas radioed in to report unusual activity in the area. His voice, usually steady and composed, carried an edge of unease. He mentioned something about a facility, strange structures hidden beyond the tree line. His transmission cut off abruptly. Attempts to reach him were met with static. By the time the search team was assembled and arrived at his last known location, Thomas Calloway was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, no clear evidence of an attack. His rifle was found discarded in the underbrush, fully loaded with the safety off. His ranger hat lay nearby, the brim torn as though it had been caught on something or torn away. But the most disturbing discovery was the footprints. They were massive, easily twice the size of a human's, with deep impressions in the damp earth suggesting something with immense weight had walked there. They were distinctly humanoid, 5 toes, an arch, no claws. They led away from the scene, disappearing into the dense forest, as if something had carried Thomas off. The official explanation given to the public was a bear attack, but the rangers knew better. Bears didn't leave footprints like that. Bears didn't abduct men without a trace, and bears didn't silence radios. 2 days later, another ranger, Nate Grady, discovered something deep in the restricted zone while assisting in the search. Hidden beneath overgrown brush was an out-of-place steel hatch, rusted at the edges with a biohazard symbol faintly visible under layers of dirt. Nearby, cages sat in the open, some empty, some containing large tufts of thick, dark fur. Scattered around were documents yellowed with age, detailing genetic modifications, hybrid experiments, and references to something called Project Hologenesis. The files describe DNA splicing, human and something else, something larger. Inside a small, half-buried outpost, Nate found a map in Thomas's handwriting. Certain areas had been marked with red X's, notes scribbled in the margins about strange movement, and lights where there shouldn't be. The tape recorder lay on the desk, the last entry partially recorded. They've been using the park. It's not just an experiment, it's growing, changing. If I don't make it back, tell... The message cut off in static. As days turned into weeks, hope dwindled. Then the sightings began. It started with a rookie ranger who swore he had seen something enormous moving through the trees at dusk. He described a tall, shadowy figure, walking upright but unnaturally fast. A few nights later, another ranger, Henry Carter, reported hearing heavy breathing outside his cabin, followed by the sound of something massive moving through the brush. He had refused to step outside. Those who continued patrolling near the restricted zone at night reported strange noises, low, guttural growls, almost like speech but too distorted to understand. Heavy footsteps that stopped the moment a flashlight was turned on. Trees snapped in the distance, their cracking sounds unnervingly close. The search was quietly called off. Thomas Calloway was officially declared missing, though no one truly believed he had simply vanished. Some rangers resigned, Others requested transfers to different parks. Those who remained avoided the restricted zone as much as possible, unwilling to risk whatever had taken their colleague. As time passed, the whispers continued. Some believed Thomas had discovered something he was never meant to see, that he had gotten too close to whatever secret lay within that part of the forest, and whatever it was, had made sure he never spoke a word about it. A few months after the incident, a new ranger assigned to Thomas's old patrol route found something odd nailed to a tree deep in the woods, a scrap of fabric, weathered and torn. It was the same color as the uniform Thomas had been wearing the night he disappeared. But it was the symbols carved into the wood beside it that unsettled him the most. They weren't in any recognizable language. They were crude, almost primal, as if they had been scratched into the bark by something with hands too large for human fingers. The ranger didn't report it. He simply turned back and never patrolled that area again. The case of Thomas Calloway remains open to this day. Officially, he was lost to the wilderness. Unofficially, among those who still work at Black Hollow, his name is spoken in hushed tone, because every now and then, in the depths of the park, someone still hears a voice on the ranger radio, an old static-filled transmission. It is always the same words. Someone reports that there is something out there. The polar Ural Mountains formed an imposing jagged expanse deep in northern Russia, their peaks rising like the spines of a sleeping beast. These mountains had long been home to myths and folklore, tales of creatures lurking in the mist, just beyond the reach of civilization. Villagers spoke in hushed tones about a wild man, a towering ape-like figure that roamed the deepest parts of the forest. For decades, sightings were dismissed as superstition, the rantings of exhausted hikers or overactive imaginations shaped by too many fireside ghost stories. Milan Horvath had no patience for such nonsense. A biologist specializing in wildlife genetics, he had spent years conducting field research across Europe. He believed in science, in observable phenomena, and nothing he had ever studied suggested that anything unknown roamed these mountains. That belief, however, was shattered in the summer of 2001 when he stumbled upon something that should not have existed. He had been deep in the forest, tracking a group of lynxes, when he noticed something unusual. A weathered chain-link fence half buried in vegetation. It stretched far beyond his sight in either direction, its rusted metal blending into the surrounding trees. There were no markings, no signs, nothing to indicate who had put it there or why. Curiosity got the better of him, and he followed the fence until he found a gap where the metal had collapsed inward, as if something massive had forced its way through. Beyond the breach lay the remnants of a facility. It had once been a series of interconnected structures, but time and nature had reclaimed it. The roofs had caved in, the walls were covered in moss, and shattered glass crunched underfoot. Inside, he found rusted equipment, metal tables with thick restraints, syringes still capped with dried residue, and filing cabinets whose drawers had been torn open. Scattered across the floor were stacks of faded documents, their edges curling from exposure. As he skimmed through them, a chill settled in his bones. They contained descriptions of hybridization trials, experiments that spoke of fusing human and animal DNA, of subjects exhibiting enhanced strength and cognitive anomalies. The documents were stamped with Soviet insignia, though the dates suggested that the experiments had continued long after the Soviet Union had collapsed. One page contained a grainy black and white photograph of a hunched, muscular figure with elongated limbs and dark, deep-set eyes. The caption underneath read, "Subject 14, escaped." Before he could absorb more, a sound echoed through the ruins, a deep, guttural growl, too low and resonant to belong to any animal he recognized. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he realized he was not alone. A sudden crash of foliage came from the trees outside. Whatever was out there was large, larger than any bear or wolf known to the region. Milan's instincts screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to move slowly, carefully, stepping back through the ruined entrance. Another movement. Something massive shifting behind the tree line. The branches swayed unnaturally, as if something far too large for the dense forest was making its way through. Then, silence. Milan didn't wait to see what would emerge. His fight-or-flight response kicked in, and he bolted, sprinting through the trees with reckless abandon. He could hear it moving behind him, keeping pace with terrifying ease. Every few seconds, the sound of branches snapping or a heavy footfall reminded him that whatever was following him was intelligent. It wasn't merely chasing him, it was tracking him. His lungs burned as he pushed forward, dodging between trees, barely keeping ahead of whatever was behind him. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, but beneath it was something else, a strange, musky odor, unlike any animal he had encountered. It was the scent of something that didn't belong, something wrong. Milan didn't stop running until he reached his vehicle, throwing himself inside and locking the doors. The forest remained still, no sign of movement, no glowing eyes peering from the darkness. But Milan knew it was there, watching. When he attempted to report what he had found, officials dismissed his claims outright. They insisted that no such facility had ever existed, that he had simply stumbled upon an abandoned logging site. His documents were confiscated under the guise of an investigation. Days later, when he returned to the site with colleagues, the ruins were gone. Not just hidden, erased. The fence had been removed, the ground overturned as if nothing had ever stood there. Determined to uncover the truth, Milan began researching the history of the area. What he found disturbed him even more. Decades earlier, during the Cold War, Soviet scientists had been rumored to have carried out secret experiments in isolated locations across Russia. Declassified records hinted at genetic manipulation trials, blending human and primate DNA in an attempt to create a superior soldier, stronger, faster, and more resilient than any human. Most of these projects were supposedly abandoned, but Milan now suspected that some had continued in secret. He reached out to locals, speaking to hunters and villagers who had spent their lives in the shadow of the polar Urals. Many refused to talk, but the few who did shared unsettling stories. They spoke of strange figures seen at the edges of the forest at dusk, creatures that walked like men but moved with unnatural speed. One old hunter recalled an incident from the 1980s when several soldiers had arrived in the village without explanation. That night, something had howled in the mountains, a sound so terrible that even the wolves had fallen silent. Milan tried to go public with his findings, but every attempt was met with resistance. Newspapers refused to publish his reports. His academic funding was quietly pulled. Emails to colleagues went unanswered. It was as if an unseen force was ensuring that the truth never surfaced. The message was clear: stop asking questions. Reluctantly, Milan let the matter drop, but he never forgot what he had seen. Even years later, the memory of that night haunted him. The rusted ruins, the terrifying growl, the unseen presence that had chased him through the woods. He never returned to that part of the polar Urals. He warned others to stay away, though he knew few would listen. The official stance remained firm. There were no classified experiments in the polar Ural Mountains. No facility, no creatures. Milan Horvath knew better. He had seen the files. He had heard the thing stalking him through the trees, and he had no doubt that whatever had been created in that facility had never been contained. Somewhere in those mountains, the wild man still roamed. In 1993, in the Sakha Republic, Russia, the land was a place of extremes, the coldest inhabited region on Earth. Its vast wilderness stretched for thousands of miles, an unforgiving expanse of ice, forests, and desolation. Few dared to venture into its deepest, most remote areas, where temperatures could plunge to lethal levels and where legends whispered of things that predated civilization. There were stories, ones passed down from generation to generation, of creatures lurking in the eternal winter, things neither human nor animal, things better left undisturbed. Viktor Petrov was no stranger to the wilderness. A seasoned hunter, he had spent years tracking game across Siberia, braving the brutal cold with a resilience few could match. He knew the tundra intimately, understood the dangers of exposure and starvation, and trusted his instincts to keep him alive where others would perish. In early November of 1993, Viktor and two companions, Alexei Morozov and Yuri Karpin, set out on what was meant to be a routine hunting expedition. They had heard rumors of an unusually large elk population near the banks of the Indigirka River, deep in the uncharted wilderness. The three men, accustomed to the isolation of Siberia, were eager for the challenge. They brought enough supplies to last 2 weeks: rifles, ammunition, thick fur-lined clothing, and provisions meant to sustain them through the frigid conditions. The first few days went as planned. They set up camp near a frozen lake, using the shelter of the trees to shield themselves from the relentless wind. Hunting was good. Tracks of elk and smaller game were plentiful, and their spirits remained high. But something was off. At night, they would hear sounds. Distant howls that didn't belong to wolves. Trees creaking under a weight too heavy for the wind alone. Then, on the third day, they found it. Viktor had been scouting ahead when he noticed something unusual. A weathered, rusted chain half buried in the ice. He tugged at it, revealing a set of broken links that led toward a nearby ridge. When the three men followed the trail, they discovered an unnatural sight, an ancient cave. its entrance partially obscured by snow and debris. Something about it felt wrong, though none of them could articulate why. The stone at the mouth of the cave was smoothed in places, as if worn down by hands that did not belong to any known creature. Rusted metal fragments littered the ground nearby, some bearing faded Soviet insignia, an old, forgotten relic of some long-abandoned operation, perhaps. Curiosity got the better of them. They entered. The inside of the cave was unlike anything they had seen before. The air was stale, thick with the scent of decay. Scattered bones littered the floor, not just those of animals, but human remains as well. Some had been gnawed clean, others left in twisted, unnatural positions. Among the debris, they found rusted equipment, decrepit gas masks, shattered glass containers, and what looked like surgical tools. More ominously, there were cages, thick steel bars bent and broken, as if whatever had been inside had forced its way out. Then came the sound, a deep guttural growl that echoed through the cavern. The men froze. Something moved in the darkness. Alexei swore he saw glowing eyes, massive and inhuman, staring at them from the depths of the cave. Without hesitation, they turned and fled, scrambling through the uneven terrain, their breath visible in the freezing air. But as they emerged back into the snow-covered wilderness, they realized they were not alone. Something had followed them out. What happened that night would haunt Victor for the rest of his life. Whatever had been in that cave was not an animal, nor was it entirely human. It stalked them, moving with an intelligence that no wild beast possessed. The trees shook under its weight, and the air filled with an eerie clicking sound, like bones snapping in rapid succession. The chase was relentless. The men ran, their boots crunching against the ice, their lungs burning from the exertion. Alexei fired blindly into the trees, the gunshot echoing across the empty tundra. Silence followed. For a brief moment, they thought it was over. Then Yuri screamed. Victor turned just in time to see something massive emerge from the darkness, moving impossibly fast. It was tall, easily over 8 feet, and covered in thick, matted hair. Its eyes reflected the moonlight, large and unnatural, filled with something far more dangerous than animal instinct. Its arm lashed out, striking Yuri with a force that sent him sprawling into the snow. Victor and Alexei didn't hesitate. They ran. They didn't stop, didn't look back, even as Yuri's screams were cut short. Their only thoughts were of survival. By morning, only Victor was left. Officials found the remains of his companions days later. Their bodies were torn apart, but not in any way that suggested a bear or wolf attack. The claw marks were too large, the injuries too deliberate. The report claimed they had fallen victim to a rogue animal, an explanation that failed to satisfy those who knew the truth. Victor never spoke publicly about what happened in that cave. He abandoned hunting, moved to a quiet village, and spent the rest of his life avoiding the wilderness that had once been his home. Determined to uncover the truth, Victor spent years researching similar cases. He discovered records of disappearances in the area dating back to the 1950s. Soviet-era documents hinted at genetic experiments, at soldiers who had been sent into the wilderness only to never return. The few witnesses who had seen anything spoke of creatures that moved like men but hunted like animals. One report, buried deep within an old Soviet archive, stood out. It described a failed experiment, an attempt to create a being that could withstand the extreme cold, that could survive where humans could not. The project was abandoned, or so they claimed, but Victor knew better. He never returned to the Indigirka River, never ventured beyond the safety of civilization again. The secret of the cave remained buried, but those who lived near the region knew better than to go looking for answers. Somewhere in the Sakha Republic, deep in the frozen unknown, something was still out there, watching, waiting, and it was never meant to be found. The untouched valleys and jagged peaks of Valle Azul National Park in Chilean Patagonia were a paradise for adventurers. Known for its remote, wind-swept landscapes, the park attracted trekkers from around the world, all seeking to experience its rugged beauty. However, despite its postcard-worthy scenery, the wilderness could be unforgiving. The weather was erratic, the terrain treacherous, and every year hikers disappeared, most due to accidents or exposure. But in 2015, a different kind of disappearance occurred, one that defied explanation. A group of European tourists, led by an experienced Chilean guide named Felipe Montoya, set out to explore the lesser-traveled trails of the park. The group consisted of 5 individuals, 2 Germans, a French couple, and a British backpacker. They had planned a multi-day trek through one of the park's remote valleys, far from the well-trodden W Trek and O circuit. Felipe was no stranger to the area. Having spent years guiding tours through Patagonia, He knew the land better than most. He understood the dangers, sudden storms, hidden crevasses, and the ever-present risk of getting lost. But on the fourth night of their journey, something happened that all his experience could not prepare him for. Felipe was the only one who returned. He was found days later, wandering barefoot near the edge of a glacial lake, his clothes torn and his body covered in scratches. He was in a state of shock, unable to form coherent sentences. When rescuers finally calmed him enough to speak, his story was nearly incomprehensible. He kept repeating the same phrase: "It wasn't human." The official investigation yielded no answers. Search teams combed the valley for weeks, finding only scattered gear, backpacks torn open, boots with deep gouges in the leather, and tents shredded as if by enormous claws. There were no signs of an avalanche, no predator known to the region that could account for what Felipe described. When pressed, Felipe refused to elaborate further. He abandoned guiding, left Chile, and was never heard from again. Locals whispered that he had seen something he was never meant to see, something that lurked in the untouched wilds of Patagonia. To this day, the case remains unsolved. The missing tourists were never found, and in the deepest parts of Valle Azul, where few dare to go, there are still those who claim that when the winds howl through the mountains, they carry with them something else. Felipe's story, as fragmented as it was, suggested that something unnatural had happened that night in the mountains. He spoke of an unnatural silence that had fallen over their campsite just after dusk, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. The usual chirping of insects and distant calls of birds had vanished. The group had gathered close, their fire crackling weakly against the pressing darkness. The first sign that something was wrong came when one of the Germans, Lucas Weber, had gone to relieve himself in the trees and never returned. At first, they had assumed he had gotten lost in the dark, and Felipe had set out with a flashlight to search for him. But the moment he stepped beyond the ring of firelight, he had felt something watching him, an oppressive sensation, heavy in the cold night air. Then, the scream. It had come from deeper in the woods, a sharp, gurgling cry that was cut off too soon. Felipe had rushed toward the sound, but when he arrived, there was nothing. No Lucas, no footprints leading away. Just silence and the feeling that he was being watched from the shadows. Panicked, he had rushed back to camp, telling the others that they needed to leave immediately. But before they could pack their gear, something moved beyond the fire's glow. A pair of eyes, glowing, inhuman, stared at them from the darkness. Then another pair, and another. Felipe had described them as too large to be human, too high off the ground. The shapes remained just beyond the light, watching, circling. And then they moved. It happened too fast to understand. The creatures, whatever they were, had descended upon the camp with impossible speed. The French couple had been the first to be taken, dragged screaming into the dark, their voices swallowed by the wind. The British backpacker, Daniel Clark, had tried to run but had been tackled to the ground by a shadowy figure that moved with unnatural agility. Felipe had done the only thing he could: run. He had sprinted blindly into the forest, the sounds of his companion's screams following him. He didn't know how long he ran, only that the trees blurred past him in a dizzying rush, his lungs burning from exertion. At some point he had fallen, tumbling down a rocky slope. When he had woken hours later, the sun was rising and the forest was silent. He was alone. His clothes were torn, his body covered in scratches, but he was alive. He had stumbled through the wilderness for days, half mad with exhaustion and fear, before finally being found near the lake. Investigators dismissed his account as hysteria, the result of trauma and dehydration. But the rescuers who had found the campsite reported strange details. Trees stripped of bark, as if something had clawed at them in a frenzy. Strange, deep footprints in the mud, too large for any known animal. And most unsettlingly, a ring of stones arranged in a perfect circle at the center of the clearing. Felipe refused to answer any more questions. He left Chile within weeks, cutting all ties to his former life. To this day, the case remains one of Patagonia's greatest mysteries. No bodies were ever recovered. No conclusive evidence was ever found. And in the most remote parts of Valle Azul, where the mountains stand silent and the winds carry whispers through the valleys, locals still speak of the night the tourists vanished. They warn trekkers to avoid the valley after dark, to never stray from the marked paths, and to listen carefully when the wind howls. Because sometimes, if you listen closely, the wind carries more than just its usual song. Sometimes, it carries the echoes of something that should not exist. In 1979, deep in northern Georgia, the Blackwood Forest stretched for over 1 million acres. a dense, untamed wilderness of towering pines, rugged hills, and winding rivers. It was a place where nature thrived, untouched by the urban sprawl creeping in from the east. Locals knew it well. Hunters, fishermen, and hikers often spoke of its beauty and isolation. But hidden deep within its thick foliage lay secrets, places even experienced locals hesitated to talk about. There were parts of the forest where compasses spun wildly, where old logging trails led to nowhere, and where strange sounds carried on the wind at night. Jason Wilkes and Danny Carter had heard the stories growing up, but they had never put much stock in them. Like most teenagers in rural Georgia, they spent their summers exploring the woods, fishing in hidden creeks, and testing their courage by venturing into places they weren't supposed to go. They knew the forest well, or so they thought. That was how they found the building. It was a squat, windowless structure, almost entirely overtaken by the forest. Thick vines crept up its concrete walls, and rusted metal doors hung slightly ajar. There were no signs, no markings, just an eerie silence that made the air feel heavier than it should have been. The structure wasn't on any maps, and there were no roads leading to it. It didn't belong there. Curiosity got the better of them. They stepped inside. The interior was dark, the air thick with the scent of damp concrete and something else, something metallic and faintly rotten. Their flashlights revealed long abandoned hallways, peeling paint, and rooms filled with rusted equipment. It looked like some kind of lab, but whatever had been happening there had been shut down a long time ago. Then they found the cages. Thick steel bars lined one of the rooms, some twisted and bent as if by something far stronger than a human. Tufts of coarse, dark hair clung to the metal, and deep claw marks gouged the concrete floor. The cages were built for something large, something dangerous. And whatever had been held here had tried to escape, and it looked like something had succeeded. A chill crept up Jason's spine. This wasn't just an old government building or an abandoned research station. This was something else. Then, the power failed. A low, mechanical hum that neither of them had noticed before suddenly cut out, plunging the facility into silence. The air grew heavy, charged with something unseen. Then came the sound. Something shifting in the darkness, slow and deliberate. The scuff of claws against concrete. A low, guttural growl that rumbled through the air like distant thunder. Jason and Danny turned to run, but as they reached the door, it slammed shut. The next few moments were chaos. Jason barely made it out. His hands scraped raw as he clawed his way through a broken side window. He hit the ground running, not daring to look back. Danny was not as lucky. He heard his friend scream, a sound so raw and primal that it made Jason's blood turn to ice. He turned just in time to see a shadow move through the doorway, something large, impossibly fast. And then the screaming stopped. Jason ran. He ran harder than he had ever run in his life, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop until he reached the nearest town, bursting into the sheriff's office, half mad with terror. Authorities arrived within hours, sealing off the site. The official explanation was a mountain lion attack, but those who had seen the inside of that building knew better. The sheriff's men found nothing inside. No blood, no signs of struggle. Danny was simply gone. Jason tried to tell his story, but soon, men in dark suits came asking questions. They told him he must have been mistaken, that he was confused. They said he needed to forget what he had seen. The warnings were not subtle. Within days, the building was demolished. The ground was leveled, as if nothing had ever been there. Jason left town not long after, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had been in that building was still out there. For years, he tried to push it from his mind. But the nightmares never stopped. He would wake in a cold sweat, his ears ringing with the echoes of Danny's screams. And sometimes, late at night, he swore he could still hear the growl, that low, guttural rumble from the darkness of the forest. Deep in the Blackwood forest, some still whisper about the lab, about the experiments that had taken place there, and about the thing that might still be roaming the woods. At the base of Mount Fuji lay Aokigahara, a dense, sprawling forest known for its unsettling silence. The thick canopy blocked out much of the sunlight, and the volcanic rock beneath absorbed sound, creating an eerie stillness. It was a place of legend, tied to ancient folklore and ghost stories, but in modern times it was infamous for other reasons. Few willingly ventured off the marked paths. Even fewer returned when they did. Yuki Tanaka had never been one to heed warnings. A rising explorer known for venturing into abandoned places and forbidden locations, he saw Aokigahara as the perfect challenge. His plan was simple: Enter the restricted section of the forest, an area cordoned off by the Japanese government for undisclosed reasons, and prove that the legends were nothing more than superstition. On March 14, 2022, Yuki set out alone. He packed lightly, just his phone, a flashlight, a spare battery, and a pocket knife he had brought more for show than for actual protection. The first hour was uneventful. The forest as hauntingly beautiful as it was unsettling. Thick roots twisted across the ground, gnarled trees stretched skyward, their bark blackened by age. The deeper he went, the more unnatural the silence became. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the rhythmic crunch of his footsteps. Then came the unsettling moments. Yuki began to feel as though something was moving just beyond his line of sight. Shapes flitted between the trees, barely visible in his peripheral vision. At first, he dismissed it as his mind playing tricks on him, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger with each passing minute. He turned sharply more than once, expecting to catch sight of an animal, but the forest remained motionless. A guttural roar, deep and reverberating, cut through the silence. It was unlike any animal call known to the region. Yuki stopped mid-step, his breathing ragged, eyes darting toward the trees. Something moved behind him, a dark, towering figure barely visible in the dim light. He spun around, flashlight beam trembling, but the trees stood motionless, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Days later, search teams found his body. He was strangely intact, with no signs of an animal attack. However, his torso bore deep, symmetrical puncture wounds, as if something had pierced straight through him with surgical precision. His belongings were missing, save for a single torn scrap of his jacket caught on a low-hanging branch. Authorities blamed wild boars, but a retired researcher hinted at something far worse. Rumors of secret genetic testing beneath Mount Fuji surfaced, whispers of a species that should never have existed. As investigators combed through Yuki's last known location, they noted unusual details. The area where his body was found had been cleared, almost deliberately. There were no footprints besides his own, no signs of a struggle, just an eerie absence of disturbance, as though something had simply placed him there. The puncture wounds on his torso were unlike anything forensic experts had seen. They were too precise, perfectly equidistant, lacking the tearing or ragged edges typical of an animal attack. Whatever had caused them had done so with precision, as if the wounds had been made surgically. Witnesses claimed that Yuki had spoken about feeling watched before his disappearance. He had mentioned an overwhelming sense of dread, an unshakable certainty that something was lurking just beyond the trees. Locals later reported hearing strange noises echoing from the restricted zone, low, guttural sounds that defied identification. The public never received answers. The investigation was closed quickly, and official reports claimed Yuki had died from exposure, with injuries inflicted post-mortem by scavengers. But those who had followed the case knew better. Online forums erupted with theories. Some believed Yuki had encountered a yokai, a spirit from Japanese folklore. Others speculated about failed military experiments, creatures engineered in hidden laboratories beneath Mount Fuji. A few whispered of government cover-ups, of test subjects that had escaped into the depths of Aokigahara, things that should never have been created. Even locals, those who had lived near Aokigahara their entire lives, spoke in hushed tones about the restricted area. Some claimed it had been off-limits since the 1970s, that it had been used as a facility for research that was never disclosed to the public. Others said that strange creatures had been sighted over the years, figures moving too fast to be human, glowing eyes reflecting in the dark. The most unsettling stories came from former park rangers, those who had patrolled the outskirts of the restricted zone. They spoke of hearing unnatural sounds at night, low, guttural growls that sent shivers down their spines, and of an ever-present feeling that they were being watched. A year after Yuki's disappearance, a group of amateur explorers attempted to retrace his steps. They set off into the forest, drawing in curiosity from those who remembered the mystery surrounding Yuki's fate. For hours, nothing happened. Then, as they reached the area where he had last been seen, they vanished without a trace. They were never found. The case remains open, but no further attempts have been made to investigate the restricted section. Authorities maintain that there is nothing unusual about Aokigahara beyond its tragic history. Yet those who dare to venture too close to the forbidden zone often report the same eerie sensation, that feeling of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the trees, silent and unseen. And sometimes, if the night is still enough, a deep, inhuman growl rumbles through the trees, carrying with it the last remnants of a warning that will never be heard.